Welcome back to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen. Well, there was a statistic I heard at the Ag Views Live meeting a couple of weeks ago, and it was this. It said that only 12% of family farms make it from a second generation to a third generation. But get this, only 3% make it from the third generation to the fourth. Now, this was a meeting presented by Bell Bank, and the speakers that day were Dr. David Kohl, Professor Emeritus from Virginia Tech, and renowned farm economist and ag economist, along with Lynn Paulson from Bell Bank. Well, I pulled these two gentlemen aside because I wanted to find out from them, what does it take to be in that 3%? Well, you'll get to hear from Dr. David Kohl as well as Lynn Paulson in this Uplevel Dairy Podcast today. This episode is sponsored by Uplevel Dairy Podcast founding partner Adiseo, a global leader in nutrition solutions and premier provider of rumen-protected methionine for dairy producers who want to optimize milk production, capture more value from components, and maintain the health of their high-performing herds. Feed is the greatest expense on any dairy operation, and don't you want to know how an adjustment to the ration will affect your bottom line? Adiseo empowers nutritionists to make informed ration balancing decisions with MilkPay.com. Customizable to your dairy's own data, this profitability calculator puts the power of real-time milk market information in the palm of your hand. Find out how much your latest ration change is really costing you with the free MilkPay app available on iOS and through MilkPay.com. Well, Dr. David Kohl, yeah, pleasure to have you here on Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
Yeah.
And you just walked off the presentation stage at Ag Views Live, where you've been addressing some agriculture lenders and farmers from Wisconsin here, but your work extends far beyond that. In fact, Professor Emeritus from Virginia Tech University and well known in the dairy industry and beyond. You and I had talked the other evening, and I learned from you that you actually were an instructor for one of the previous guests I've had on this podcast, Greg Bethard from High Plains Ponderosa.
Exactly. He was one of my students at Virginia Tech.
So your experience is obviously very deep in dairy and in agriculture at a scale. The thing I want to focus our conversation on today is something that ties together Lynn Paulson's presentation and yours. Lynn said something that really stuck with me. He showed a slide that talked about the success of family farm succession and noted that the success of transferring from a second to third generation is 12%. But from going from a third to fourth generation is 3%. And so what I want to hone in our conversation in the next 10 minutes here is really, what does it take to be in that 3%? So Dr. Kohl, you hang out a little bit with Warren Buffett.
Well, I attend the meeting, yeah, but I get a chance to hear his philosophy.
You shared something in our meeting today about what he said when it comes to balance sheets. Can you share that?
Sure. One of the things they asked Warren Buffett, if you had any financial statements to analyze and observe, what would it be? He said, very simple, balance sheet. He said, I've analyzed over 100,000 balance sheets in my lifetime looking at acquiring companies. And he says a balance sheet will tell you your secrets. In other words, a balance sheet over time will address your priorities. It will tell you what you're reporting, what you're not reporting. It'll tell you whether you're using the magic wand, in other words, the pencil or the computer to change the values, or is it earned net worth? It'll say what's being said, what's not being said, what's underreported. And one of the things is, are you investing in assets that are generating income, or are they non-generating income and assets? So that balance sheet really can give a glimpse of a lot of things in your life over time.
And you agree with his statement?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I would say the cash flow is important. The income statement's important, but I can't disagree. I haven't looked at 100,000, but I've looked at many of them, and you can pick up very, very quickly. For example, if I see accounts payable going up, that might be an indication that we're having a cash flow problem or a profitability problem, or we misprioritize our investments, or we might have a family living withdrawal issue. So what you got to do is, and with the experience and the wisdom, it helps you connect the dots.
Can you put that into terms for a dairy farmer? So for someone who's the owner of a dairy farming business, how might they look at their balance sheet, and what type of things are they looking at to really tell their own story?
Yeah. I think on a dairy farmer, of course, historically we said, well, a dairy farmer didn't need to keep working capital around because we're getting a monthly check or a check twice a month. Well, one of the spots that I think a dairyman needs to focus in is on the top half of that balance sheet, current assets and current liabilities. And again, what have you got for inventory? What have you got for accounts receivable? For example, many of the dairymen now are raising dairy beef. What are those steers worth, et cetera, et cetera? And then over on the other side, do you have enough assets there to be able to cover your accounts payable, to cover your line of credit, to cover your principal due within 12 months? And so I stop right there at the top half. And working capital, we used to say cash and working capital is king. Well, I got set straight up in Canada. A lady came up to me and she goes, Dr. Kohl, she goes, I believe working capital and cash is queen. And I says, well, explain it. She says, you ever played chess? And I said, sure. She says, what's the most important player? Queen. And she says, the queen's there to block adversity and take advantage of opportunity.
Right.
And that is why that dairy person out there, like Greg, one of the things is having a real good gear on that working capital allows you to proactively take advantage when opportunity comes down, but also help block adversity. Say milk prices go in the tank, or something happens with dairy beef, or say you had something happen on the operation. It's there so that you don't have to sell assets when everybody else is selling assets, but you can acquire opportunity when it comes along. So again, that's one stop that I would hit on. The other one, I'd look at the intermediate assets. Do you have investment into assets that are going to be generating you income? For example, the dairy cow would be an example of one. Do you have the necessary machinery and equipment? And one of the things I also look at machinery and equipment and facilities is it rust out, worn out, and faded out? And then over on the other side, how much debt do I have against those intermediate assets? And then, of course, we go down the long term, and everyone looks at land. Land is 82% of the U.S. farm balance sheet. On dairies, it'll probably be a little bit less. But one of the things that I want to know is, okay, what's the mortgages against that land? Because guess what? If cash flow and profits fail, your backdrop is the working capital, and then your backdrop is, do you have some equity in land so that you can refinance? So it can be a defensive mechanism. But the bottom line on that balance sheet, I look at how much of the net worth was earned net worth, retained earnings, versus the magic wand, changing the value of land, or those dairy cow, or those dairy beef animals with the magic wand, and what we call the paper wealth. Ideally, you want the earned net worth, but hey, that paper wealth also can be very, very important as well. So that is your magic ride through the balance sheet to an individual dairyman out there that is looking at their business. And then one of the things is knowing that balance sheet, taking ownership of those numbers, and then be able to communicate them to a banker like Lynn that was on your previous podcast. That is very, very important. And often we'll hear dairymen, well, I got to fill out those financial statements for the banker. Well, you fill out those financial statements not only for the banker or the lender, but also the management of your business. And that's one of the things I want to hear from that dairyman.
So you've talked about the balance sheet and the value of sharing those numbers with management, but another piece of your conversation today that you placed a really high value on was looking at this business management mindset. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, it's called the business IQ. Buffett, he says the difference between successful businesses and non, it's their behavioral mindset. And I used to have this business IQ, and the problem was people were just checking the boxes. But I've upgraded it, and it's called REM. Do you respond? Do you execute on what you say you're going to do? And then do you monitor it? For example, do you know your cost of production? Do you execute? And do you monitor it as economic conditions change? Do you develop your goals? Do you put them in writing? Do you follow and do you monitor to see how you achieve those goals? Marketing and risk management program, same thing that you could do there. Do you develop a monthly cash flow or a quarterly cash flow? We use a weekly cash flow in our creamery business, but then do you look at those numbers and then do you monitor those numbers and then do you make the necessary tweaks and adjustments? I call it REM. Respond, execute, and monitor. And Lynn talked about character today. And it's very difficult to quantify character, but it's not, because that REM chart that I showed, we went through 12 categories, it defines your behavioral advantage character, which is extremely important. And then, if it's a family business or, say, a business like Greg's, are they transferring that management mindset to the new managers or the new owners or the next generation out there? Or are we a control freak and we just keep it close to the vest? I find that in the future, that we used to be, I grew up in upstate New York on a dairy farm. We were independent and we didn't want to deal with people. Behavioral advantage is going to be interdependent and dealing with people. And I had it put bluntly. Up in New Hampshire last fall, dairyman got up and he says, "You're exactly right." He says, "I used to get more profit through more milk." He says, "My daughter, who is now moving into ownership and management of the farm, she will go as far as her ability to deal with people and work with human resource." And everybody thinks that's labor. No, it's working with your supplier, working with your lender, working with the public out here. So I thought that was a very, very decisive comment.
So this is that behavioral mindset. And that is what you've identified as the most telling of character, whether it's you're looking at your team, evaluating yourself.
No, exactly. It puts the odds in your favor. It's not going to guarantee success. None of us are guaranteed. You aren't. I'm not. But one of the things is it puts the odds in your favor. And that's all we can ask for. And you know what I said to the group here today? It's not rocket science. It's doing the basics. I call it the 5% rule. Dr. Danny Kleinfelder, he passed away, and he used to have the 5% rule, and he analyzed farm businesses that were successful. They're 5% better in many areas like production, cost, and efficiency, finance, marketing, human resource. And you know what? If you're 5% better, you will compound those little incrementals, and by compounding, it makes a big difference over time.
Well, Dr. Kohl, I know that we have limited time with you today, but very grateful for the few minutes you have to share. And as a wrap-up question from the presentation today, but also from your experience working with dairy producers, I want to invite you to speak directly to the core of our audience with Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
Sure.
And this is dairy producers ages 28 to 44. They're in that, oftentimes, that third, fourth generation of a family farming business many times. What would you tell them, in addition to what we've talked about with balance sheets and behavioral mindset?
Sure.
What's your one last key message to them of what it's going to take for them to be a successful next generation in their own family business?
I think one of the things, they have to be very deliberate in their goal setting and have them in writing, because what this will do is help them focus on the controllables and manage around the uncontrollables. You can't manage DC, you can't manage fishing. And what you got to do is have those goals. And those goals are business, family, personal, mental, physical, spiritual, because you've got to think about yourself and be very, very deliberate about that. I think the second element is take the ownership of those financials. And oftentimes we will only look at our financials once a year for tax season. No, do it throughout the year and have a deliberate plan. And can I just share with you, sometimes this is where you bring in your lender or advisor group. One of the things I would have to tell the younger producers, have either a formal or informal advisory team. And sometimes those advisory teams might be a peer, and they're not just going to be yes people. They'll question why you're doing this and why you're doing that. The other thing is be very deliberate in their education. In other words, select education that will move you. By the way, in education, you're informed, you're engaged, but every educational event should be able to bring 2 or 3 actionable items back either into your business, your family, or your personal life. And then I would have to say, in just a philosophy of wisdom, never equate your self-worth to your net worth. It can be very fleeting. Success is measured in dollars. Significance is what you give back to others. And I would have to say, if you have children or plan on having, or a neighboring kid that's interested in agriculture, one of the things is the best crop you'll ever raise will be that next generation. So that would be my concluding advice.
Well, on that note, Dr. Kohl, thank you so much for sharing your insights, not just on business, but really on living a life of fulfillment and purpose and being able to be successful as a farmer all along the way. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, and keep up the good work, and hopefully we'll be back again.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Kohl.
Thank you.
You just heard from Dr. David Kohl, who reminded us that thriving across generations isn't just about working harder, it's about working smarter. From keeping a strong balance sheet to setting deliberate goals and continuously building our business management skills, Dr. Kohl painted a clear picture of what it takes to beat the odds and ensure the family farm doesn't just survive, but truly thrive. Now we're going to build on that foundation with insights from someone who spent decades helping farm families put these principles into practice. Lynn Paulson, Vice President of Agribusiness Development at Bell Bank, joins us to talk about the nuts and bolts of making generational transitions successful. Everything from involving the next generation in decision-making to planning for different economic scenarios, Lynn's perspective bridges financial strategy with real-world application, offering tools you can use today to set up your farm for long-term success. Let's listen to this conversation with Lynn Paulson. Well, Lynn Paulson, welcome back to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
Love to be back. I enjoyed the last one.
Yeah, so you and I got together about a year ago following an event called AgViews Live, and you just blocked off the presentation stage again for this 2025 AgViews Live, where you and Dr. David Kohl have been enlightening lenders and others in the agriculture community on some of the trends that you're seeing and what you believe are the things that set producers up to be profitable and successful, as well as some of the things to be watching out for from an economic level, as well as from a habits level, and also looking at how to position themselves financially for long-term success. And so, Lynn, you are the Vice President of Agribusiness Development at Bell Bank. The thing that really stuck out to me, there's a slide you shared today that grabbed my attention, and it's related to a topic of family farm transition and succession, a topic that is so pertinent to a lot of the folks that listen to this podcast and so many in the ag community. And this is what that slide stated. You said that when we look at succession, only 12% of farms are set up to go to a third generation. But when we look at transitioning from a third to a fourth generation, we're getting down to 4%. 4%. And so expand a little bit on that slide and what that brings up in your mind when you look at those statistics.
When you take a look at that, obviously there's a number of factors that play into that, right? First of all, is that next generation there or wanting to? But I would offer that probably the biggest reason that those numbers aren't higher is probably the preceding generation doesn't have things in place for it to go to the next generation. I've seen so often where you've got 75-year-old farmers or ranchers or dairy people, whatever, that their next generation isn't participating in the business decisions and is probably as much of a hired man as anything, right? Those that I think that are successful bring that next generation into the management where they actually do have a role in making decisions. It just makes that transition that much easier, especially when you're transitioning assets that are worth a lot of money. But to be ultimately successful, it needs to be a little bit of that overlap. It can't be, okay, dad dies or grandpa dies, and then you go to the next generation. It's got to be a seamless deal that has things already set in motion to handle when those things do occur.
And so what you just shared there was that success depends on that next generation having some management skin in the game. But then there's the other piece of the puzzle, and that's a financially feasible business that is positioned to support another family member, sometimes an entirely second family, sometimes 3 generations at one time. So walk us through a little bit of what that looks like on paper, what you see the most successful farming businesses, specifically dairy, if you have some of those that come to mind. What are they doing? What numbers are they looking at and honing in on to make sure that they can be in that 12% or even 4% that are successful?
I think it's about having that transition plan and having it documented, and a transition plan and a business plan for how that's going to be handled, right? And having certain metrics that if we're going to expand, or if this is the next step within the operation, this is what we need to do to support that next family. Like you said, sometimes we have 3, sometimes 4 generations. And sometimes you get, quite frankly, too many hogs at the trough, and there's not enough income or net income to support all of that. And then how you divide out those responsibilities and duties among that. But there are so many good metrics, especially in the dairy industry, about the efficiencies and profitabilities, and when that next step is taken, when it becomes feasible to think about bringing in the next generation. And if that's not there, then you need to take a look at, okay, we need to step back, call an audible, and say, is the succeeding generation willing to take a little bit less to make the next generation successful? But it really is, Peggy, all about communication and everybody being on the same page, being willing to openly and honestly share concerns and being able to bring that out on the table without any concern about blowback from whatever. A lot of these things, the people may not all agree, but they can collectively have a plan and agree to move forward.
And so when you talk about that planning process, and again, looking back at financial feasibility, one piece of that process is really having a clear valuation of assets. And I want to specifically hone in on the assets of cattle and land, because right now, those two things are extremely valuable. So just speak a little bit to what you're seeing for trends in land ownership, land values, and where you see that headed from your area.
Probably talk about land values first, because that's still 80% of the average farmer's balance sheet, both in terms of equity and assets, right? So, when you take a look at the strength of American agriculture, the underlying strength really is the farm real estate, right? As I mentioned today, I think we probably have peaked out a little bit with the high prices of land, but I think land is still in really tight hands, right? There's not a lot of leverage on real estate. And so I think we have peaked. I don't think we're in for a crash like we had in the 80s and that type of environment. But I think there could be a reset a little bit on some of this, especially if you're going out and having to buy that land and pay that kind of money, and you're borrowing money to do it. If you're playing with house money, that's one story, whatever. You can afford to take that 2 or 3% cap rate and be okay with it. But if you're going out and doing that and you're paying 7 or 8% interest on that, that changes the dynamics and numbers a lot. With respect to the rest of the assets, I think it's important to do a real honest valuation of those assets at least on an annual basis, because you're really seeing, for example, livestock prices, dairy cattle, beef cattle, whatever, those are increasing and obviously worth a lot more than they were a couple of years ago. Conversely, machinery and equipment probably is depreciated a little quicker, right, on a market value. So you need to be realistic, maybe even solicit a third party, whatever, to give you a valuation on that. But if you're putting together a plan and it has a buyout number and a number attached to it, it probably should be attached to something that's fairly well documented, both from a pragmatic perspective and even maybe from a tax planning perspective.
So that hits up the land part of the conversation. But if there's one thing we know about the cattle side, whether it's dairy country that I'm in or even cattle country where you're in North Dakota there, Lynn, it's that those numbers don't look the way today that they did a few years back. And so just talk a little bit about the trends that you are seeing and where you see that cattle market headed.
Yeah, especially I'm probably more familiar with the beef side, but we have some interest in dairy as well. That's really been a massive game changer, especially on beef cattle. When you take a look at feeder cattle and 500-pound weight calves being $3-4 a pound, and it really is crazy. But they feed them out and they go to some pretty heavy weights and are still bringing pretty good money That changes. I think the big thing in the dairy industry, obviously, is beef on dairy. That has really changed the dynamics of the dairy industry. And I would generally say that if it wasn't for the beef on dairy and strong coal prices, whatever, for cattle, the profitability picture would change there a little bit, right? So how do you manage that? I think we always talk about scenario planning, and at some point, if there's a downturn, whatever, how does that impact my profit and loss? How does that impact my balance sheet? But these are some pretty good times, especially things that are connected to the beef side, right? And in lending, it's really all about liquidity and working capital. I mean, the underlying financial strength and net worth is important, but boy, that working capital is your first line of defense. It's your shock absorber. You're playing with some house money. You're not asking the bank for the first dollar out. So it gets to be, you've got so much more flexibility in your operation, and maybe even taking advantages of opportunities out there that may arise, early discounts or buying distressed assets or whatever the case may be. But there are opportunities if you do the right things with the money in the years that you're making it.
So as we look at, again, these pictures and these markers of success for being able to be in that top percentage, really the minority of family farms that are able to successfully move between multiple generations. We've touched on a little bit of that management and planning side, the financial side, and the valuation side. But what else? Lynn, you've been doing this for a long time, sitting at the table with family farms. You actually were doing this in the 80s. So you went through some of the most stressful and difficult times that any lender has ever seen. If you could summarize in the last couple of minutes that I have you here, Lynn, what does it take to make it in today's world as a family farming business? What would you say?
Yeah, great question. And really, that really is still at the heart of American agriculture, right? Is the family farm. And it is concerning that, in this era of consolidation, that seems to be slipping away. But when you take a look at going back in the 80s and taking a look at art, I think the key really is to have a good set of people around you. And it could be family members. It could be a good tax advisor. It could be people that you really have trust that can give you good, honest advice about things, and being willing and open-minded to listen to an opinion that might be different from yours, right? When you go back and you take a look at the 80s and those type of things that you mentioned, there are a number of problems, right? There is obviously some real economic problems that happen with land values and things like that. But in that environment, both the regulators and the bankers overreacted. It was just a simple overreaction, and there wasn't the fortitude or the discipline to say, hey, this is kind of nuts. We took out some people that shouldn't have been taken out just because there was an overreaction and you threw the baby out with the bathwater. That, I don't necessarily see that happening today, but again, you need that good team of advice. You need a really good lender, right? And a lender that's not afraid to say no. It's my job to lend you money. It's my job sometimes to say, no, I don't think this is good. Or if you really want to do it, you can say, you go ahead and do, but this is what it's costing your operation. And some of the best feedback that I've gotten over the years from customers is not having made them loans, it's having to say no at a time when emotionally they really wanted to make this purchase or they thought it was the right thing. And from a impartial third party, this just doesn't make a lot of sense, and you ultimately decided not to do it. That's really been kind of an interesting positive feedback that a person gets.
Throughout your tenure in this business, you've been able to see that side, the other side of having said no and the success that can sometimes be a result of that.
No question.
And we have a couple minutes left with you, Lynn. Would you like to talk about family living expenses?
That really becomes a slippery slope, right, for bankers, because it's a little bit of a moral hazard, because you're really talking about things that are at the heart of a family. And I think the thing that a lender like myself has a perspective of is to see a little bit on a bigger picture, how the family living is increased. Is it when you have just one operation, you have nothing to compare it to, right? We can say family living is high, and compared to what? Well, we do have some data to compare it to. And I think that really in a lot of operations has gotten out of hand in some cases, especially in times when money is being made and things are good, whatever, you ramp that up. It's difficult to bring it back down when it isn't there to support that. The other thing that I always put into perspective a little bit is that there's an awful lot of family living that goes into farm expenses and your Schedule F and so forth. And if you're a W-2 wage earner, what you would really need to make to support the kind of lifestyle that you're supporting. I would just say on the family living though, Peggy, the biggest thing is you got to know what that number is, right? And most people really don't know what that number is. I really suggest that producers not only have a farm budget, have a family living budget, and be realistic about what that is, and don't kid yourself, right? I mean, and so in a lot of cases, that number, I think it's a lot higher than most people think, especially on the farm side. And the farm just gets to be an ATM withdrawal to take that out. So if you're making money and you can live that, I think that is absolutely great. But if you're layering up debt to support that, that can be problematic.
Well, Lynn, thank you for sharing these insights from AgViews Live, but also from your many years of experience egg lending, sitting down at the table with family farms across the country and helping them find success, and for the tips that you shared for others today.
I can't think of a better business to be in.
All right, Lynn Paulson, Bell Bank, thank you so much for jumping on with us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again to Bell Bank for presenting AgViews Live and the opportunity to sit down and hear from Lynn Paulson from Bell Bank, as well as Dr. David Kohl, Professor Emeritus from Virginia Tech University and renowned farm economist. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and until next time, keep on growing, keep on learning, and up-leveling your dairy.